So for the Robin Kelley congested terrain, I want you to think of it in a number of different ways. I think of this article in a number of different ways. The time period is important. World War II. We can talk about some of that. You can look at the PowerPoints and kind of get a sense of what's happening in this country around World War II. We've already set up some of this. We're coming out of the Great Depression. We're now fighting a war against Japan and the Nazis in Europe. Right? This idea of white supremacy that the Nazis are going to put out there. So it's already an interesting moment to think about issues of race. World War II. We're ultimately going to win that war. But we don't know that at the time. I mean, the Nazis are a particularly powerful, war machine. Japan is no joke in the Pacific, right? Pearl Harbor's going to happen in this whole period. So a lot of this stuff was up in question, whether democracy was even going to survive. So it's interesting to see how the home front becomes a battlefield as well. Like the home front becomes a battlefield as well. So part of what Robin Kelley does in this congested terrain article was compare the home front to the battlefield. He says, look, they're not much different in some ways. People are struggling on the home front, and they're struggling on the battlefield as well. They're fighting for what they believe in on the home front, and they're fighting for what they believe in abroad. They're willing to risk their lives on the home front, and they're willing to risk their lives abroad, right, for ideas of democracy, equality, all these fair treatment, however you want to kind of label it. We're obviously most interested in what's happening here in terms of African Americans, but we want to connect it. So I had some notes that I want to use. First thing he says is these buses, right? This is about civil rights activism or resistance on public transportation, right? Buses. He calls them theaters. Now, normally when we hear theaters, we think of one of two things. Where you go see a movie at a theater, or theater of war. So it's interesting that in this article set during World War II, he's going to say these buses are theaters. This is where a lot of the action is that we can now view and study. Why public transportation? Why do you think this is such a contested area? We're not talking about the voting booth. Right? We're not even talking about schools yet. Public transportation has always been this kind of contested area. Think back to when we talked about Plessy versus Ferguson. What was that case about? Trolley cars, public transportation. Right? Why do you think public transportation might be this particularly interesting site for contest?
Well, I think because back then that was the only way you could go from place to place in a fast amount of time, and the fact that people use public transportation all the time to get from place to place.
Good, exactly. Institutionally, there's something built into public transportation that's going to make it this location where folks meet. Like you said, folks, especially working class folks, are required, and essentially they rely on public transportation. If you're going to your job downtown, but you live outside the city and you don't have a car, right, you got to get on public transportation if you're going to get to work, if you're going to pay your bills. Right, so he talks about this significantly. So, and not only about class, but racially. Now, black and white folks are using public transportation in Birmingham, Alabama in the 1940s. So they're probably the closest they're ever going to be sitting on a bus. Right? Closer than church, which tended to be segregated. Closer than schools, which were segregated. Right? This is the moment where folks start bumping into each other.
If you get a car, if you were like from a dealership, if you were black though?
Yeah, you could, but you had to have some money. This was still a class thing. Some folks do have cars, but most folks do not. And it's segregated too. Yeah, you can find there are even some black dealerships. That's possible by the 40s and 50s. But yeah, the majority of African Americans are not going to have. It's a kind of a cultural thing too. I come from Los Angeles, where that's a car culture. It develops actually in this period. Most folks have, not most folks, but many folks have cars. The city was even set up with freeways in a way that you almost have to have a car. Public transportation out there is not very good. I remember getting stranded, 8:30 o'clock, because the bus just stops running. They assume people have cars, and I'm walking home the rest of the way like, what's going on? In this big city. Right? But at this point, that wasn't really the case. That's going to be a post-World War II really development in most of the country. So most folks are relying on public transportation in this city, and in this case, buses. And so this becomes, and think if you own the bus, I think if you own the bus, the market again, right? You want to make money, especially if you own a bus that's running through a primarily black area. You say, look, they got money too. Whoever's got the fare, I want to get them on the bus, but I also want to kind of fit in with the laws of the time and Jim Crow. So how do I get black money, but yet still keep these white customers? Well, let's just put a board, right? They talk about the color board being put there, this kind of artificial color line that so many people are going to end up battling about, right? It's really artificial in a sense.
They actually had a color line?
Yeah, they actually had a wooden board that they would put, say, if you have 20 seats, it might start at seat number 10, right? Where you put this color line, everybody black has to be behind the board, everybody white can be in front. But it moves, right? You can move it depending on how many folks are getting on the bus. So you're driving through West Baltimore, you might move it up a little bit to 15, so you have 15 rows where black people can sit. But then you get to downtown Baltimore, you might move it back. Okay, I know more whites are going to get on. Whites have first priority in terms of sitting down. So the blacks in row 10 through 15 have to get up and move back and stand, right? Bless you. So that's where a lot of the issue came in. If you're, like one of the article talks about a pregnant black woman, like, I'm not getting up. You see all this? I'm not getting, I'm tired. Right? Or Rosa Parks, right? Or Claudette Colvin, or others that did it before Rosa Parks, that are saying, I'm not moving. Why should I have to move? Right? And it becomes a question of enforcement then. Tell me something about the bus drivers. Those of you that read this article, what's going on with the bus drivers on these buses? I think of bus drivers as nice, jolly fellows, right? Helpful, give you a transfer, they'll tell you when to get off, right? What were bus drivers like in Birmingham in the 1940s?
I think some of them kind of took the colored side. So like I remember he was talking about an old white lady who was always trying to cause trouble.
Right.
And she was basically trying to move the color line back. And said they should move back even further, even if there's no white people on the bus. And in that case, the bus driver took their side. They said she's always causing trouble.
Yeah, that was one of the surprising ones, right? That bus driver actually is like, this white lady, she always causes trouble. And people are surprised by it. Like, this is not usually how, usually a white woman would have been defended, but she kind of had a reputation for being difficult, and he's kind of like, oh, ignore her. Again, people recognize how rare that was in a sense, but it does show the important role of the bus driver on one level. What else do some of these bus drivers do? What's their position? They're not just bus drivers, right? They're really a part of the institution of public transportation and the system in a sense. What were they like? Anybody else? Read Congested terrain? Let me give you a hint. Most of them are strapped. That's the first thing. They're strapped. Why? Why does a bus driver need a pistol? Well, it was decent. It was decent. It wasn't great. You heard some of that might have been part of the tension and part of the reason why so many of them were so mad, right? They didn't have industrial pay, but they did better than most folks, though. And they might have felt like a lot of these African Americans were taking good jobs, right? That becomes part of the debate, too. Well, why do they need guns, though? Why would a bus driver need a gun in 1940s? Huh? Protect them for what? This is the bus, right? The bus is a nice place. Yeah, there's almost the expectation that there was going to be conflict, right? So they talk about bus drivers having guns and blackjacks, I always think of a thing for the car, undoing the lug nuts, and would use them, right? If you read that article, if you haven't, you'll see countless examples of bus drivers clocking folks, shooting folks getting, what? You don't want to move? Move back now, right? This happens. It still seems weird to me, because I still think of like the jolly bus driver, like, hey, come on in. Bus drivers were not playing around. They were like police, essentially. They were part of the institution. They were supposed to enforce these rules. It was really their job to kind of enforce Jim Crow and racial supremacy. Again, that's why it's so surprising in some respects that one bus driver would go against that white woman in that one instance, because usually that wasn't the case. What about the other passengers, especially they talk about the white passengers on these buses? Now remember, we've seen these contests over public transportation numerous times already. Ida Wells, right? She gets in trouble in 1884 on the train, 12 years before Plessy. That's 60 years before this. So we have a long tradition of this. public transportation as kind of the major site of contest or difficulty. And also, again, part of what I want to raise with this is it's also a site of resistance. This is not, we don't want to just sit here and talk about how folks get beat up, black people getting beat up again. But they're resisting. This article is making the case that they're going to use public transportation to resist white supremacy.
Once before.
What'd you say?
Did he try it once before?
Who?
Homer Pleasy.
I don't know exactly his background. I think so. He was definitely inclined to do it, and that's why those local activists know that he's going to be a good test case, right, to kind of set it up to really try it this time, right? That's an era before camera phones, so they really had to set it up properly to make it work, right? World War II, new militancy. I've kind of talked about this already. This is a moment, right? World War II is a major tipping point in American history and African American history. When you go abroad, fight a war for your country, 4 years worth of war, see people die, get killed, lose friends, kill folks. Especially imagine you're an African American soldier. You're killing some Germans, killing some white people. In an era where you can't look white people in the face, you might start to say, maybe they're not so invincible. Maybe they're not, different than me. They die just like we do. Then you come back and get on the bus, and you're told you got to sit back here, you got to do this and that. So it's, again, this is one of the reasons he focuses so much on servicemen and women, right, that come back and even wearing their uniforms are kind of disrespected. They come back with a certain seriousness. You're a soldier, you go to war, you come back with a certain seriousness. You're not really willing to deal with the same trifling stuff you might have been willing to deal with before. Come back with a different look. I got a lot of friends that have been abroad, and they come back like, man, I'm not worried about that. Look, I almost died over here. You better tell me something serious. Don't bother me with that. All right, that's foolish. So now they come back, and they're serious, and they're thinking about, what am I willing to risk my life for, what am I not willing to risk my life for?
Yeah, a lot of World War II, black World War II vets got cut down because they were taking it more seriously, and white people didn't like that, especially down south.
Yeah, especially in the South. You come back from, Nazi Germany, seeing concentration camps and such, and then you come back to Birmingham, right, deep South, and folks in Birmingham say nothing's changed here. You say, well, everything has changed in these 4 years. We remember tipping point is a point where you can never go back. I can't go back to living the way I was, then. People have changed, right? Folks have changed. War kind of speeds up that process sometimes, right? War speeds or can speed up that process. It doesn't necessarily have to. That's why a lot of historians say the Civil Rights Movement doesn't begin in the 60s. It begins at least as early as World War II. At least as early as World War II. We can just look at the home front and see that.
Yeah.
What else is going on these buses? Give me an example. 30 of you, at least 5 of you must have read this article. What else is going on in this article that's noteworthy? What are women doing? Y'all black women, y'all just sitting there daintily and putting on makeup in the bus and being polite and ladylike and.
They were also part of the protest too.
What? Ladies? Nice, polite, quiet, demure, not as strong as men? Yeah, there are more women arrested on the buses than men. More women arrested on the buses for protest than men. Yeah. Oh. What types of things are they doing? You can get arrested for any number of things on the bus. Many get arrested for being loud or cursing the bus drivers. It's amazing that you get a $50 fine or 30 days in jail for cussing somebody out. But you could if you didn't get shot or beaten up. Go ahead. Yeah, the one lady that she gets on. There's a couple ladies fighting with the umbrella. Whatever weapon you had, right? One lady gets on the rain and I guess bumps a white woman or something. They talk about them fighting all the way down the aisle. Right? One lady got on and sat down next to a white man, and he socks her, right? So her and him are going at it. And it sounded like she was beating him up. That's why it sounded like he was so mad. Beats him with her umbrella. Takes his umbrella, it breaks. She's beating him with that, right? Women are saying, look, enough is enough. Enough, I'm not playing. I'm not playing with this anymore. Black women are really, really important in this era and in this position on public transportation. Interesting how gender is just not just important, it is just important, but different, but the same in some ways than race. Black women in particular can show us a lot about what's happening on these buses. For one thing, most black women are working as domestics. They're working as domestics in white homes. So they ride public transportation more than anybody else because they're going from the black neighborhood to the white neighborhood where people can afford to employ domestics. They're often transporting white children. So they're really complicating this. Okay, where do they sit? If the bus is 20 rows long and 10 rows, halfway down is the bar, do they sit in the black section if they have white children with them? Or do they sit in the white section? Because they got these white. Actually, they talk about the bus having rules about that. Right? If you have white children with you, you could sit in the white section because you wouldn't want to have to subject the white children to the black section. Interesting, though, right? But is that, well, wait a second. You need to have people separate because race is so important. Remember, the social construction of race, right? Well, you can sit up here if you got the right people with you. You said what? Can't let them, be by themselves. So it's interesting when the exceptions to the rule work, right? What does it show us? That race is socially constructed. It's made up. We make up the lines. And literally, we can move the color line when we want to. It's really interesting to look at public transportation as an example of this.
So is that like how most of the white passengers were on the bus?
Yeah, anything about white passengers that stood out? What's going on with white passengers? A white passenger might be again, people are individuals, so you had a range of responses. But what are some of the examples that we see of the behavior of white passengers on these buses riding with African Americans? So you guys complain I talk too much, and then you ain't got nothing to say. I'm going to talk some more then. I do. This is true. Y'all paying money. You should talk. Got my degree. 3 of them. He said, do I know what I'm talking about? I don't know. Sometimes I don't know if I know what I'm talking about. White passengers are complicated. Again, we don't want to simply talk about it. Some passengers, I think, I can imagine them just trying to stay out the way, especially as more and more of these African American riders seem to be becoming more militant. They're talking about talking loud on the bus or talking. You may sit in the back, but you talk loud enough where the bus driver can hear you. I wish he would come back here. That happens quite often. Sometimes he does come back there and a fight would ensue. But some passengers actively assist. Right? They talk about several of the white passengers having pistols themselves and pulling them out to enforce this color bar. Right? Talked about one white man that beat up a black woman and hit her in the head with the gun. Right? So there's any range of responses. Some feel like, there's a system of white supremacy in place and I have a role to support that system. Others may not even have believed in white supremacy, but maybe they're benefiting from it. Look, I got a good seat, seat right up front. I like the system, perhaps. Some may have felt bad about it. Some may, it's interesting to think about the variety of responses you might get. What's also interesting is to think that as an individual, everybody must choose. Everybody must choose. Even if you don't believe in the system, if you're a white rider, if you don't sort of follow the system, you could get attacked by other whites. All of a sudden, you're a nigger lover. Right? Or arrested for violating Jim Crow. It's interesting how the system and the institutions are set up to control people are really on both sides of the color line. Even bus drivers, they could lose their jobs if they don't enforce the system. So whether they agree with it or not is really kind of secondary. There are some examples in the chapter. Stephen Edwards on page 58 was a rider that gets on it. He gets shot a couple times. Shot 4 times, I think. Black servicemen, black women, we've kind of talked about a lot of this. Part of what Robin Kelley is doing with this article is he wants to complicate African American history. Right? We've been talking about some complicated issues we haven't noticed in this class really throughout the semester. Right? How often do we ask a question and there's not really just one answer for it? Part of what Kelley is doing here is complicating our understanding of African American history. How is he doing that? He is using class he's using a class analysis to really complicate the racial analysis that's already built in. So for example, he's saying, look, civil rights, traditionally, we've only focused on, quote unquote, middle class things. Right? So integrating Harvard University. Right? You want to force your way into integrate colleges or Harvard University. Eating at a lunch counter, right? You want to eat at the finest restaurant, you're not allowed, so you protest and force your way in. What he's going to say is, look, most black people were working class anyway, so even if they had the legal right, they couldn't have the money. Ella Baker, in the 1960s, who was one of the very important civil rights leader, wrote an article, said it's more than a hamburger. It's more than just having access to these things. We need to change the institutions that keep people from having the money to do anything. What does it matter if you can go to Harvard if you can't afford it? If nobody that looks like you can afford it. So a lot of folks are going to take it that other direction. Kelley is doing something really complex, and he's saying, I'm going to look at public buses. We're going to study the civil rights movement by looking at public buses, because that's where you'll find working class and poor people. And working class and poor people and women were just as resistant as Martin Luther King. It's not just about understanding the leaders. It's not just about understanding black people that might have had a little bit of money or access or education. You didn't have to have any of that to get on the bus. You just had to have enough to get on the bus. Right? So it's interesting how he chooses to study African American history, and it's really important when we think about it. We don't just want to study, as they say, history from the top down. You can't just learn everything about Barack Obama and think you know about every African American person's experience, because his experience is very unique, very rare. Right? So it's interesting to think about race and class and gender as it comes up in this article. Yes, sir.
Well, a fellow Rudolph is important too, because he tried to lead March on Washington in the 40s around World War II.
Same time period.
And,
It's a good example.
But he got Roosevelt to negotiate.
It's a great example. If we think about World War II as kind of this context, right, where a lot of these things are happening at the same time. There's a lot of things happening at the very same time. I mentioned A. Philip Randolph. We've seen him before. Remember, A. Philip Randolph was a labor leader, early civil rights leader. He's the one that introduced Marcus Garvey. Kind of gets him his first audience in Harlem, essentially during the Harlem Renaissance. He's still a major leader in the 1940s, and he threatens a march on Washington. He threatens to march on Washington during World War II. And he says, look, we're fighting Nazis and white supremacy abroad, yet we don't have any of the democratic rights here. We need to bring 100,000 people to D.C., march on the White House, and make our voice heard. And he says it's the perfect time to do it during World War II. Why? Because look at what we're saying. We're telling the world at this point we're going to fight for democracy. Democracy is necessary. Everybody's equal, and Hitler's a bad guy. He says if we bring 100,000 people to D.C., they're going to be like, well, wait a second. You guys are the ones talking about this democracy stuff, yet half your population doesn't have it at home. He actually gets the idea from a black woman who says we should march on Washington. He's like, you're right. They start printing up flyers. They threaten this march. It seems like there was a lot of people going to make it. And ultimately, the president at the time realizes this will be very embarrassing for the United States. This is going to be particularly embarrassing if we're trying to fight Hitler, trying to raise morale in the war effort and support the war effort. If 100,000 black people come to D.C. saying, look, you guys are hypocrites, you're just like Hitler, how is that going to look? And so they have to settle. They really have to kind of to deal with this. They get him to call off the march by promising certain things to African Americans, and they do some of them. Roosevelt would do certain things. He founds, for example, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, tries to make it so that more African Americans can get jobs and more work, and that you can't discriminate based on race. So some executive orders and some laws get passed to kind of keep Randolph and these African Americans from marching on Washington. Again, the very same time that this is happening in Birmingham, there is this threatened march on Washington in D.C.
Did Hitler kind of make fun of us for that?
Hitler would try to use some of this propaganda too. You black soldiers, and you don't have rights in your country. Why are you coming to fight me about Aryans? Right? He would sort of play on that. Although Hitler obviously doesn't like anybody, especially but people of color in particular. He would try to play on that to undermine the American war effort himself. Chapter 19 is all about that. I'm only having you read part of Chapter 19, as you saw in the email, but I'm going to put the whole PowerPoint up. I do think it's particularly important to think about this broader context. There are so many things happening in this World War II period. 1943, right, smack in the middle of World War II, right, smack in the middle of a lot of these examples. There are race riots in Harlem, Detroit, and several other cities. And these race riots are different. Again, instead of whites just going to these communities and attacking kind of innocent people, unarmed people, now it tends to be people of color upset, especially around issues of police brutality and violence, right? And they start burning stuff down. Not very different than what we saw, or seeing currently. Not very different than in LA riots or Watts riots in '65. It's interesting to think about how often this has happened. How often this has happened.
How is that different, though?
How is what?
How is that different?
I don't think it's necessarily different. At least some of them are not.
They kill other people,
Hmm?
other than the fact they kill people.
How is
That, that people died in Detroit, so.
you saying? How are those race riots different than earlier ones? Or
I mean, to the one now. What happened last night.
I don't know if it necessarily is. It's really based on frustration. Again, how folks choose to show that frustration is up for interpretation, but it really was based on some of the same ideas, especially frustration over economic issues, police brutality, Jim Crow generally, and that time period. It's really a complicated kind of thing. There were the Zoot Suit riots in LA, 1943, same year, where Mexican Americans are attacked because they're wearing Zoot Suits. Blacks and Mexican Americans will wear these Zoot Suits. You've seen early, the first part of the Malcolm X movie, he was a Zoot Suiter in the 40s in Harlem. Right? Same thing happened on the West Coast in terms of Chicano Latino folks. They get attacked for a couple of days in LA during the war by U.S. servicemen. Any Mexican American seen on the street wearing a Zoot Suit gets beaten up, some die, and they strip them naked, laying on the ground naked to take these clothes off of them. Talk about how the significance of clothing. Right, clothing is this kind of cultural significance for example.
Why did they attack on the West?
Interesting. Zoot Suits, if you think about, I want you to think about clothing as a kind of cultural, the politics of culture that we've been talking about, right? How you look and how you dress yourself sometimes has a political significance. During World War II, there was something called rationing. Anybody know what rationing is? What is rationing?
It's like when you try to limit the amount of something to
Mm-hmm.
in this case, because conserving the war effort.
Exactly. There's rationing because you need various things for the war effort. So there were things called meatless Mondays, right? Americans choose not to eat meat on Mondays so they can send more of it to the troops, right? So there's this direct connection between supporting the troops and the war effort abroad and what you can do at home, right? So it's not just the soldiers on the battlefield that are affected by World War II. Folks at home are affected as well. You see all these drives to recycle iron, right, for weapons and such. Textiles were one of the things on the list that you weren't supposed to use a whole bunch of clothing materials. You make uniforms and all these things for the war effort, right? This happens at the very same kind of stylistic moment where Zoot Suits are the fad. If any of you have seen a Zoot Suit, it's like real big shoulders, real wide, right? Gets tapered at the bottom. This was kind of the style. You know how young folks are. You want to look fresh, right? So young folks, black and Latino in particular, are wearing these Zoot Suits, and to many it seems like they're being un-American. You're not following the ration. You're wearing these foolish suits. Now, if we translated this into 2015 terms, politics of culture, the politics of clothing, it would look different. Folks ain't wearing Zoot Suits now. But what do young people do? You got them skinny jeans on, you're sagging, right? Jordan, there was a movement a couple of years ago in Atlanta to give people tickets. If you can see you're sagging a little too hard, $250 ticket. Some folks say that's freedom of speech, right? Freedom of expression. Other folks say I don't want to see your butt. Interesting how culture, right? The politics of culture may come into it. But in this particular context, it was very much connected to World War II and this idea of patriotism or imagined unity. You're not really being American. In fact, you're being un-American, was the way it was looked at, and they attacked them. you folks up. Again, think about this, the time period. We're going to compare the 40s to the 60s to today. I think there are some interesting parallels. It's not exactly the same. Right? The context is different. But it's interesting to think about some of the parallels there. Coinciding with much of this, I'm going to give you a handout here in a second that's going to frame our last couple of discussions. Actually, I'll give it to you now. We're going to be tracing three main phases of civil rights. Three main phases of civil rights. I want to give this to you now. We're going to need it for the next few classes, so don't lose it. I'll take a copy on Blackboard. What this handout is essentially a, my hands up before I get a ticket. Essentially, it's an overview of, quote-unquote, the civil rights movement of the 60s. I keep putting the 60s in quotes, because we're really already talking about civil rights, even though we're talking about the 40s and 50s. It's not just going to be limited to the decade of the 60s. So I want to use this handout to talk about the various developments and phases of, quote-unquote, the 60s or civil rights. Yes, sir?
You didn't put anything about World War II.
No, I did not. But if you look at the timeline part of it, it goes back further than World War II.
No, I mean, I'm saying, though, I mean, there were a lot of important events that happened to the civil rights movement. So, in that time, too.
I'm not going to spell it all out for y'all. Y'all got to do some work here. You don't like my handout? Is that it? You don't like my handout? Yeah.
Oh.
Actually, I gave them all out. No, I didn't. You're right. I'm sort of playing with the time, but I'm not. This is not comprehensive. Not every event, related to the 60s is going to be on here at all. First of all, I want to get it on one page. That's why I made the font so small and accident. But I do want to. You raise a good point, right? If we're saying it's not just the 60s, we need to be serious about that. So first, look at the timeline. And let's mention a couple things in chapter 19. You'll notice with the timeline, it starts way back with the end of Reconstruction, right? Way back with this class. The 60s, civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, and all these things that happen, Civil Rights Act, they get passed, Voting Rights Act. Many of them say that the civil rights movement was the second Reconstruction. You'll often hear that phrase. It was the second Reconstruction. And it was supposed to finish what was started back in Reconstruction. And we've seen that, right? You get a 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, yet for 100 years, people are still trying to vote. So again, think about really the connections we've been drawing all semester. And now we're looking at them in World War II and into the 50s and 60s, but we really could take it all the way back to Reconstruction. The next date on there is Plessy, which you just were talking about. Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, this landmark decision that says that segregation is illegal, essentially, finally overturns Plessy versus Ferguson. It takes 60 years, but it finally legally overturns it. Yet, do all the problems end in 1954? No. The civil rights movement in many cases is going to pick up steam after that. And after the law gets changed, now you got to change behavior. Right? Behavior is always harder to change than law. So it's interesting that part of what I wanted to point out and what you sort of pointed out is that it doesn't start with the 60s. In fact, many of these dates far precede the 60s. But before we get back into that, I want you to skip down to the bottom. The last part really, in a general way, kind of maps out the three major phases of, quote-unquote, civil rights. Three major phases. Now, they're generally seen as coming one after the other, but that's not really completely true, as we've already seen. Right? I'm going to say a little bit about that, and we're going to deal with it more this weekend into next week. These three main phases. The first one, legalism. Legalism. Generally, a definition of legalism is using the courts, or trying to use the courts to achieve civil rights. Trying to use the courts to achieve equality. So organizations like the NAACP were pretty prominent, right? They're going to try to use the courts. We talked about in the 30s and 40s, they're trying to get anti-lynching laws passed. Right? Ultimately, Thurgood Marshall, Charles Houston, and others are working for the NAACP, right? Our library is named after Thurgood Marshall. Are going to achieve some things. They're going to actually win some cases, especially by the 1950s. But it's generally the legalism phase or approach or method or tactic is to try to use the courts to achieve equality and civil rights. This philosophy basically says, you know what? America had a good foundation, had a Constitution's a good document, Bill of Rights, all that stuff is great. We just don't live up to it, they would say. All right. It's not the problem. The laws aren't the problem. It's people. We can actually use the laws to make people act right. Kind of Cliff Notes version of this. So Thurgood Marshall and others are going to spend years fighting cases and trying to change the law, trying to change the system as it's set up. This is a picture of Thurgood Marshall, Donald Gaines, Murray, and Charles Houston. Charles Houston was the mentor for Thurgood Marshall, a very important figure here in D.C. Both of them working here in D.C. Howard University, right, is going to be a major area producing a lot of the figures that we see, including Thurgood Marshall and Charles Houston. So that's legalism. The second phase, and we're pretty familiar with this second phase. Well, first, we would say legalism, we primarily identify with the period between the 1930s and the 1950s. The quintessential case is the Brown versus Board of Education case, 1954, right, that's supposed to overturn Plessy. That's kind of the tipping point for legalism as a phase. Second phase, we're very familiar with this phase, right? Nonviolent direct action. Nonviolent direct action is using nonviolent strategies to try to achieve civil rights. Right, so you're building on the foundation of legalism. Figures like Martin Luther King are best known for this. Marches, peaceful protests, boycotting businesses that won't hire you or allow you to shop there. Trying to integrate schools, sit-ins. He's primarily identified with Martin Luther King. This is pretty much in its heyday between 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycott and 1965, where folks are really starting to tire of nonviolence as a strategy, or maybe starting to think maybe it's not working. We'll talk about that. Selma. And it's also the assassination of Malcolm X, the rise of groups like the Panthers and others by the mid to late 60s that we'll talk about.
Do they know who did?
Who did?
Killing Malcolm X.
Yeah, there were several. It's a complicated question depending on your view. Several members of one branch of the Nation of Islam were convicted of it, but many others think that government may have had something to do with it, CIA may have had something to do with it. There were some suspicious things that happened around that killing. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into Malcolm X, but for some reason, for example, all the police disappeared right before he got killed. So some people are suspicious about that possibility. So we'll think of these basically black power, black nationalism, the last phase. In some ways, it's going to reject nonviolence as a strategy. Some are going to say that nonviolence no longer works. And we'll talk more about this next week. That's pretty much in its heyday from the mid-60s to the mid-70s. So kind of like 10, 15-year periods for each of these. Again, we've already said that they really overlap. Right? The dates are not completely, as we see. On these buses, this is some nonviolent direct action and some power happening in the 40s. But you can generally think of them operating this way. And we're going to spend some time breaking down some of the key figures. Back to this chapter 19. Again, I'm putting the whole PowerPoint up, although I'm only asking you to read a couple of sections to kind of fill in some of the gaps. The congested terrain is one reason you got to make sure you read it if you haven't read it. What you see in the 40s are some interesting things. It talks about this emphasis on assimilation and culture. So there's an emphasis in the 40s, especially around the war, of okay, let's just be the best Americans we can be, and ultimately maybe we'll be accepted. Right? Sounds a lot like Booker T. Washington from 50 years earlier, right? Just fit in, don't make too many waves, and ultimately you'll be respected. Close ranks, right? There's several things that get pointed out here, especially culture. Should you emphasize kind of the uniqueness of African American culture, or should you basically make the case that African Americans are just like any other Americans? Right? There are kind of competing interpretations of this. So some folks write, stories and tell tales of African American uniqueness, while others say no. Black people are, as one person said, simply white men in black skins. Now, again, the point in saying that was, look, they're just like everybody else, treat them right. But obviously, you can see how that might be problematic too, right? Just like you, just got black skin, right? So there's some various things happening culturally and politically. Social scientists begin to challenge the biological premise of race. So now we know, right? Race is socially constructed, all these sorts of things. At the time, though, people thought it was strictly biological. You're completely different. You're almost a different species. So we get a lot of help from the scientists and from social scientists, historians, anthropologists, sociologists, and say, look, people are, they're not that different. We're not that different. And so Jim Crow is wrong because of that. Culture, right? People are raised in a certain culture. That's why they behave and speak and do certain things certain ways. It's more of a cultural analysis than a biological analysis. Again, there's a debate over this. Franz Boas, I mentioned Franz Boas last week. He was a very important anthropologist. He was also the mentor, one of the mentors for Zora Neale Hurston, where she kind of learns anthropology. Him and Melville Herskovits, hard to say that name, argue over kind of the significance of this culture. Herskovits says, should have this assimilationist view. Should try to fit in, integrate into American culture. Yet, at some point, Herskovits says, you know what, African culture is unique. There's something unique to it, and we should emphasize that as well. So this notion of African survivals, that the certain cultural traits have outlasted slavery and earlier periods. So even by the 40s and later, there are things you can point to and say those are uniquely African. There's even, language. Right, the word okay, for example. Many anthropologists and linguists talk about that being an African origin word that gets mixed into American culture. So folks are using culture in interesting ways. We can sort of leave it at that. Black history. Should you emphasize African American history or Black history? Or should you just study American history? This is still an ongoing debate. Some folks think you shouldn't be in this class. I'm studying just Black people. Some folks think it's not worthy enough of a subject. There's not enough to talk about. Now, you know that's not true. You've been talking for 15 weeks and aren't half done. Right? Some folks think you should only do American, yet others say, look, African Americans have been left out largely of American history. I told you the first day, this class is harder than American history in my view, because you got to learn American history and you got to learn what Black people did and how they reacted to it. You're learning multiple things at once. Carter Woodson is a great example of this. He's known as the father of Black history. He starts Negro History Week, which then expands to Black History Month, to kind of point out at least one month where you think about some of the issues that have been overlooked in kind of mainstream history. Some folks say you shouldn't do that. Some folks say that that's a mistake, that you're dividing yourself by celebrating a Black History Month or a Women's History Month or a Jewish History Month. Say what?
Like what they're trying to say, things celebrate all the time and stuff with just 1 month.
Most people are saying that you shouldn't study it at all, right? That it's divisive to focus just on one group of people. Hispanic or Latino History Month is divisive, right? They're usually not saying that you should study it all year. Let me skip through some of this stuff. The arts are going to take on the same debate, right? Should you focus on particularly African American stories? We already talked about this essentially when we talked about the Harlem Renaissance. Right? What sort of art should you put out there? You have artists like Native Son, artists like Richard Wright, who wrote Native Son, Black Boy, and some others. He feels like it's the author's role to voice the oppressive conditions of Black working class people. So he writes novels that really made waves. Right? Native Son and Black Boy. You had things like this Black guy accidentally killing the white person, and what's going to happen to him. He's very influenced by the Communist Party. This notion of being political in your art. He did not want to separate art and culture. He wanted to show how bad racism was and its impact on people, whereas others are going to have a problem with that. Melvin Tolson. Melvin Tolson was an important poet and college professor. And you've seen the movie The Great Debaters with Denzel. This is part of his story, right? He was the professor in that school at Wiley College in Texas, right, where he's going to help this debate team that ultimately defeats Harvard in debate in the 30s and 40s, which was unheard of, right?
Harvard was all white school back then.
What was?
Harvard.
Oh yeah, Harvard. Well, mostly. Remember, Du Bois is the first one to get his PhD there. You had some exceptions, but for long periods of time, Harvard would not accept African Americans or Jews and other Catholic. Huh?
Why didn't I do
Yeah, he was exceptional. He couldn't go there as an undergrad initially, but he eventually gets there by the time he gets his PhD. But they always were small numbers if they were accepted. There's a kind of history of that. And in this, it got better or worse in some periods. In the 30s, for example, it was very difficult to be a Jewish person and get in and go to Harvard. I said Howard. Harvard. So again, think about how culture is political in this period as well. Richard Wright's Native Son, Ralph Ellison, An Invisible Man, another excellent book, wins an awards, but talks about kind of the impact of race on culture. Chapter talks a lot about black internationalism. So once again, African Americans looking outside the U.S. border, even before World War II, kind of forced people to look outside the border. Right, so Ethiopia, for example, is a great example of this. In the 30s, Ethiopia is attacked by Italy, who's going to be one of the Axis powers in World War II. Right, this is shortly before World War II. Ethiopia becomes this symbol, very important symbol for African Americans and other people of color, because Ethiopia is one of the only countries to avoid being colonized by Europe. We talked about 1884, how Europe carves up the map. Ethiopia was able to maintain its independence, and in fact, when Italy attacks Ethiopia in 1896, Ethiopians whoop them. So Ethiopians put a whooping on Italy, which is very embarrassing for this prominent power. And so Mussolini later on says, I need to avenge this embarrassment, and he attacks, and does, is able to defeat Ethiopia in battle. Right? Got tanks rolling in, and folks that didn't have tanks are not going to be able to deal with that. But what happens is, thousands of people from around the world, including African Americans, many of them go help fight fascism, especially the fascism of Italy and Spain, and ultimately Hitler in World War II. So it really is the beginning of a response, international response. Yes, sir.
They were going over to Italy, even though they had a fascist dictator who didn't like black people.
Well, they weren't going to fight on Italy's side. They were going to fight against.
No, I mean, if they're going over there to live in Italy,
To go over to live in where?
in Italy, during the war.
Wait, who was going over there?
African Americans. Because they fought there too.
I'm not understanding the question.
I mean, during World War II. When they went over.
When they fight in Italy.
Yeah.
Well, Italy's on the other side, though. They are fighting. There is a lot of fighting in Italy, Mediterranean and other places, but Italy is on the side of Germany and Japan. Now, is that what you're talking about? So they're fighting there, but they weren't fighting for the fascists.
Weren't they fighting against them though when they went over there to Sicily? No.
Yeah, they were fighting against Italy. Yeah. And really, the reason why I think is interesting. Why do that? Why go abroad and fight? This if you don't feel some kind of connection to it. It's really a kind of Pan-Africanist connection, to use Garvey's phrase, because you're not fighting for the U.S. at that point. This is before World War II happens, before Pearl Harbor. So it's interesting to think about how folks are going to make those connections. Talked about Paul Robeson and the Cold War, the development of the Cold War. A lot of that gets laid out.
Did Ethiopia get involved?
That's a good question. I don't know how much. They were sort of dealing with the difficulties of Italy after 1936. How a lot of historians look at it, the Ethiopian conflict and the Spanish Civil War, was those were kind of dress rehearsals for World War II. So Hitler, for example, sends troops to Spain, right, to kind of test out all his new tanks and stuff. And then when Europe doesn't really respond in certain ways, he kind of feels more emboldened to do what he's going to do in Europe. So 36, when he's sending Nazis to Spain, is only about 2 or 3 years to where he's going to do the same thing in Europe.
So I guess that had nothing
It's interesting because some folks say, well, what if they had stopped Hitler then, or what if they had stopped Hitler in the first year, or they stopped him after he takes Poland? It's hard to say. I mean, history is complicated. Part of the difficulty was he gets practice. Right? The German army and everything is the strongest army in Europe by the time World War II starts. And so one of the reasons why Britain doesn't really want to stop him is because they know it's going to be a difficult fight. Right? If maybe World War II had started too early, Hitler would have won. Because he was ready for war. He had been building up during the whole Depression, whereas the rest of Europe wasn't ready. So again, history worked out the way it was supposed to work out in some ways. Maybe U.S. wouldn't have gotten involved. Right? So we might be speaking German right now. Right? So you never know how these things play out.
I don't know if they were invading the United States, so would they?
He had plans to ultimately. He didn't like this whole mongrelized nation as it talked about. It was a dangerous symbol of a non-white nation. And he also was afraid of its industrial capacity, its economy and whatnot. So eventually there would have been a problem. It would have just a question of how long that might have taken. A lot of the chapter talks about early civil rights coming through the labor movement. Again, A. Philip Randolph is a good example of this. He was both a union organizer and someone that fought for civil rights. So it's interesting how labor and workers coming together and then fighting for their rights really is an example of civil rights. Right? Now, sometimes these unions would exclude African Americans, though. Sometimes they would welcome them. So it depended on the industry, it depended on the union. And it's also going to push organizations like the NAACP, we talked about this, to focus more on economic issues. Not just about voting, or not just about integrating a restaurant, but how about providing the types of opportunities so folks actually have the money to spend in that restaurant. Which some see as even more radical when you start questioning economic relationships. We'll talk more about that when we talk about Martin Luther King's development next time.
They said that was the job was like the main driving force behind the Detroit riots. So, because a lot of people, black people, working in the Ford factories, so.
Mm-hmm. Attention. Exactly. You remember the whole Great Migration. You got folks going to cities like Detroit, to the motor industry, the auto industry. Detroit becomes this major African American center, which it still is. And yeah, some of the tensions are between workers who feel like their jobs are being taken. White workers feel like blacks are taking their jobs. Yet others that want to unionize and say, well, if we get everybody in the same union, we can all fight for better rights. So there's differences of opinion around there. It's a complicated context. Jackie Robinson, 1947, he's going to integrate baseball in that sense, right? So it's really a questioning of a lot of issues around race in this same time period. They actually wanted to do it several years earlier, but it takes this long to kind of happen. And Jackie Robinson is specifically chosen, right?
Well, you used to have black ball players back when the league
had a whole Negro leagues, and you had other figures, right? That was a kind of a civil rights movement. They chose him. They knew he could take the punishment. They knew he could take the death threats. They knew he could not respond violently when folks spit on him and did stuff. Right? Because there were others that weren't really going to do that. He was seen as patriotic. He was a 3-sport letterman or 4-sport letterman at UCLA. So in a lot of ways, he was well positioned, right, to sort of become this symbol of civil rights. Sort of like Rosa Parks. Right, she's well positioned, very appearance-wise, appeared middle class. Right? We just read an article about how folks were doing stuff on buses, 10, 20 years earlier. Claudette Colvin in Montgomery, a young 16-year-old, I think, or 19-year-old black woman, 9 months earlier than Rosa Parks, does the same thing. But Claudette Colvin got pregnant without being married, and she was a teenager, so the NAACP and others didn't think she was the right symbol to hold up to sort of craft integration. So it's not always about the individual. Sometimes it's about how folks want to use that individual, how they see them as either exactly spreading the right message. We'll talk much more about that when we get into nonviolent direct action. President Truman is going to integrate the armed forces shortly after World War II. 1948, a lot of that is signed into law. Truman does quite a few things in terms of early civil rights. He makes an address at Howard University. That in and of itself was significant. President of the U.S. speaking at a black university, 1952. Mentioned Charles Hamilton Houston before, and this strategy of legalism, right? He really crafts this strategy. You're going to fight using the courts. First on a local level, move up to the state level if need be, move up to the Supreme Court ultimately.
But do you think he was better than Roosevelt?
That Truman was?
Yeah.
Roosevelt was pretty favorable for the most part. Again, a lot of it's context, right? Roosevelt was seen as pretty favorable for African Americans. His wife in particular was very friendly with several African American folks, and they gave folks jobs and that kind of. Roosevelt couldn't do a lot because a lot of what the president has to do is negotiate. So every time, for example, Roosevelt would propose something in terms of civil rights, Southern senators would block it. So a lot of it wasn't just him. These things are complicated. Truman may have gotten more done, kind of like Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. Kennedy is seen as more favorable for African Americans. Lyndon Johnson actually got more done. But it doesn't mean, Lyndon Johnson called black people N-words too.
Kennedy never got the
Yeah, in his 3 years, he didn't finish. He didn't finish what he started. In part, perhaps, because some folks saw him as too friendly with African Americans. So the end of this chapter is talking about a lot of the early cases in legalism. So I have with this, 1936, the University of Maryland ordered to admit a black law student. So it's interesting. You'll see several of these cases, especially around law schools. There's one picture, I think it's in here actually. Maybe it's coming up. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's in the previous chapter. They show a black law student sitting in the room next to the rest of the class, right? Because he's admitted to the law school, but they didn't want to let him sit in the same room. It's interesting to say the least.
Texas law school?
Yeah, I think it was the Texas one, which means Lincoln.
It's like they had like the messed up library and stuff.
Some say they have to build a whole other school if they're not going to admit him, right? Because especially once Brown is passed, what do you do? How does separate but equal really work? This is the beginning of the separate but equal Brown case, right? In 1952, the NAACP took 5 school segregation cases to the Supreme Court, asking that separate but equal be struck down, and he ultimately gets this Brown decision out of that series of cases. It overturns Plessy, finding racially separate public education is inherently unequal and contrary to protections provided by the 14th Amendment. And later, a year later, you get Brown 2, which says that the country should be integrated, quote, with all deliberate speed. So we need to overturn this. They don't give a timetable. They just say with all deliberate speed. What does that mean? What it means is that people don't do it, right? What it means is that people resist the ruling so that 10 years later, Martin Luther King and others are still fighting for these same rights. Exactly. You get tremendous opposition, not only just from Southern white people, but Southern congressmen. They signed this manifesto, Southern Manifesto, saying, I don't care what the Supreme Court says, I'm not doing it, right? So it's interesting on that level. You had leaders, elected leaders saying, I don't care what the Supreme Court or the president says, we have not integrated. So this is what requires the whole nonviolent direct action phase, the whole, Martin Luther King and others to sort of come up. And this is where we'll kind of pick up next time. Depends.